We talked last week, we studied last week in chapter 16 about David's anointing. We went through that chapter completely, and we talked about Saul and the way what came upon him, about the evil spirit that came upon him. We had a great discussion last week about the evil spirit, the Lord put an evil spirit upon Saul. And it's like somebody told me the other day, the text says what it says. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And we're just going to leave it at that. That's the only thing we can do. We can take different views about that, and but we're going to let the text explain the text. But I want you to notice, and we didn't talk about this last week, Samuel is in verse 13 of chapter 16. Samuel took the horn of oil, and he anointed David in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. And the last part of that verse, so Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now that's the last time we're going to see Samuel for a while. After chapter 17 and 18, Saul and David, well, Saul in particular, he chases David all over the place. And David is fleeing for his life. And everywhere everywhere David goes, Saul is going to try to kill him. Pride takes over, jealousy takes over. We're going to talk about that some more when we get there. But chapter 19 Samuel re-enters the picture. If you look at chapter 19 and verse 18, so David fled from Saul, and he escaped from Saul, and he came to Samuel at Ramah. And then after that section in chapter 19, the next time we read of Samuel is chapter 25 and verse 1, and Samuel died. So Samuel's nearing the end of our study. He's exiting the picture. You know, he was pretty much the forefront at the beginning of this book, and now the kings have been chosen, Saul and now David, and David's taken over the story. And Samuel is exiting and will soon die. But chapter 16 ends, and chapter 17 is our story of David and Goliath. When we talk about David, what comes to your mind when you hear his name? Give me some terms or wait. A man after God's own heart. I'm so glad you said that. Versus Bathsheba. And I know that was bad, and David got what he deserved. It's kind of like talking about Peter. We can't talk about Peter without his denials. And, he did that on his own. He chose to do it. But that's a scar that carried him throughout Scripture. And today, when we study Peter, we talk about that. When we study David, we talk about, first and foremost, he was a man after God's own heart, but then Bathsheba also comes into the picture. What's something else that you think? He was a great man of war. Exactly. We're going to get to that over 2 Samuel chapter 7. We're going to study that. Hopefully we'll get there. Jerry, I don't know. We may not. But great man of war. What else? Very courageous. Very courageous. We're going to talk about that tonight. Mm-hmm. It's something to be such a mighty man of valor, a great man of war on one end, and on the other end, he's a harpist, musician. That's something. What else?
He understood what God could accomplish through him.
Exactly. At a young age.
Right.
At a young age. What else?
He could have killed Saul 3 times and he passed by.
He could have.
He would not kill him.
Because he knew it was not what God wanted.
What God wanted, so he wouldn't do it.
Exactly. Exactly. How old was David here in chapter 17? The text doesn't tell us, but we can kind of get close. Does anybody know? Or anybody want to take a shot at it?
I say he's probably 17, 18 years old.
I don't think he's quite that old. And here's why.
Okay, well.
I can see a debate coming.
That's right. Well, you had to be 20 years old. You go back in Numbers, somewhere in Numbers. I read it last night. You had to be 20 years old to be in the military under that law, under the old law. How many brothers did he have? Did David have? 7. He was the youngest of 8. How many brothers, and we're going to read it, how many brothers was in the military? 3. So he had 3 brothers they were at least 20 years old. Okay? So the 4th oldest was, let's say, 19. I don't know. And so he's on down. He's at the bottom. He's the runt, remember. I'm going to place him, James, somewhere around 15. Now, you take, I don't know if the text does not tell us if there were twins involved or if there was another mother, if those boys had a different mother. But I'm going to put him, in a lot of commentaries that you read, we'll put him around 15 to 16 years old. And I think that's very important when we enter chapter 17 to place his age where we place it. And it's such a vital lesson for both young and old. James.
One thing we knew, he could not wear Saul's armor, so he had to be fairly small.
Exactly.
Even though he was a man of stature, he was.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So let's place him, let's put him at 16. You know, that's a big age for teenagers these days, because at 16, what do you get to do? You get to crash your car. That's right. You get to crash your car. So let's put him, for the sake of this class, and I'm not going to print this, don't record this or anything, but let's put him at 16, okay? And I think we'll be fairly close. That's going to be a fairly good guess. So let's remember that as we enter into this study. Back over, you remember the important verse, chapter 16, verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. You know, the oldest brother had just walked out. Remember? For the Lord saith not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh where? He looketh on the heart. He looks on the heart. The Lord doesn't care about your physical stature. He cares about your inward stature. Turn over to 1 Corinthians. Let's look at something. A small section of verses. And I always like to give my reference material that I use. This is a book by Wilson Adams, and I use this. I'm taking a lot of his thoughts, and he made this point that we're going to over in 1 Corinthians 1. It's a class book that Wilson Adams put out. It's called David. And that'd be very good. It's very simple, to the point. I mean, David's not a hard study, a complicated study. And Wilson makes a lot of excellent points in his book about this. So 1 Corinthians, with chapter 16 and verse 7 in mind, and the anointing of David, God choosing David, keep that in your mind as we read these verses. 1 Corinthians 1, and let's begin with verse 23, 22. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, there's not many mighty, there's not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and the things which are despised, these things hath God chosen, yea, the things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are. Why, Paul? Why? Well, verse 29, that no flesh should glory in his presence. And in verse 31, according as it is written, he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. So, you take those, look at those terms. You have weak. I'm going to turn over in my big Bible to that because I've got my notes over there. You've got some terms that are opposite of each other. You've got foolish in verse 27, or verse 25, you've got weakness, stronger. You've got foolishness, you've got wiser in verse 25. And then in verse 28, you have the base things of the world, he's despised, and so forth. So you have those opposing terms that God is saying there. What's Paul saying there in 1 Corinthians when you keep 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7 in your mind? What's Paul saying?
Same thing he told when he was choosing David to be king. Don't look at the outer actually look at the inner heart.
Because God is in control. God is in control of this, and I'm going to pick this run of the family to be the king. And I'm going to show you, he's going to show you that we don't need an enormous, physical, beautiful type guy to run this thing. Mike.
There couldn't be a more classical example that back in the New Testament times of God knowing what he was doing when he chose Paul. Everybody was afraid of Paul of what they saw, but nobody saw his heart.
That's right. Who saw it? God saw it. God saw it. That's exactly right. So, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I want to read verses 1 through 11. Verses 1 through 11. And Mike, would you read that, please?
Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. I guess I'm saying that right.
That's good enough for me.
And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spear head weighed 600 shekels. And a shield bearer went before him. And he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Okay, up there it's in verse 4, it says Goliath of Gath. Do we know anything about Gath? Turn over to Joshua chapter 11, and we're going to place your finger there and then turn over to Numbers chapter 13. Joshua 11 and then Numbers chapter 13. Joshua chapter 11 and in verse 22 says, Joshua 11:22 says, there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. They were only in Gaza, in Gath, in Ashdod there remained. Okay. What happened? That's Joshua. That's them taking over the land of the Israelites. They've taken hold of the land of Canaan. And they're battling these enemies. And the Anakims there were none of them left in the land of Israel. They were only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Who were the Anakims? The giants. Numbers 13. Numbers chapter 13, the latter part of that chapter. What happens in the latter part of that chapter? Numbers 13. What happened? What just... Do what? Who saw them? The spies. The spies saw them. And here comes Joshua and Caleb. Here's the minority report. And look at verse 33. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in their own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So, Goliath is from Gath. Gath had a bunch of Anakims in it, people of Anak. So therefore, I'm going to put 2 and 2 together there and say Goliath was probably from the descendants of Anak, one of those giants. So Goliath of Gath, back in 1 Samuel, let's turn back to chapter 17. Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He's described, my first question is that Goliath is described as a champion. Why would he be described as such? Why would they describe Goliath as a champion?
Because he was their thoroughbred.
He was their thoroughbred. That's a good one. I didn't have that. That's good. That's good. He was their thoroughbred. And he, head and shoulders above everybody. And he was their ace. I love baseball during the playoffs. I'm not much watching it during the regular season, but when it gets to playoff time, man, the cream rises to the top, and I just love like the World Series. And when a team is ahead in the 9th inning, going into the 9th inning, and a team is leading by 1 run or 2 runs or whatever, what does that manager usually do with his pitching staff? What does he usually do? He brings in his ace reliever. All you baseball fanatics, Mariano Rivera, who was probably the best relief pitcher of all time. He just retired here not long ago. Played for the New York Yankees. And buddy, when the Yankees were leading going into the 9th inning and he hit the mound, the sports writers closed the books. The game was over. And the team could not wait to get to the 9th inning to send in their champion. Now, Take that back to this day. These Philistines send out their champion, and there's none like him. There's none like him. Look at the size of this guy. He is 6 cubits and a span. How tall is that?
I had it like
9 feet. About 9.5 feet. A cubit is from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. That's a cubit. Now, it may be longer. It's a lot longer on a lot of people than it is here with me. But from right there to right there is 1 cubit. And he was 9 of those. And it's about 18 inches, thereabout, give or take. 18 inches. I bet it was too. I bet it was too. What's a span? It says 6 cubits and a span. Yeah. Now that's a big span right there. Look. From the tip of your tongue, the thumb, tip of my thumb, to your pinky. That's a span. So he was 6 of these and 1 of those. And that measures out. I got my calculator out and I put the inches in and everything. You figure it up. And it's about 9.5 feet, give or take. James.
What if they use this span? It'd be a lot longer.
Be a lot longer. Be a lot longer. But I think they used the 18 inches, and then the span was a half of a cubit, which would be 9 inches. And that's what they went by. And this guy was 9.5 feet tall. It's not a fictitious story. Bruce is 6'8". 6'8". This guy is almost 3 feet taller than Bruce. 9.5 feet. And a 16-year-old is getting ready to fight him. Describe his stature. We just got through describing his stature. His armor. Look at his armor. Verse 5. He had a helmet of brass. A brass helmet. We've got some pieces of decorative things around our house that are solid brass. And they're not very big. And you pick it up and you think, it's going to be real light. But you pick it up and it's heavy. A solid brass figurine is heavy. And this guy had a solid helmet of brass. And a lot of soldiers wore them back then. But anyway, this guy had a big head and it was a big helmet, solid brass. He was armed with a coat of mail. What's a coat of mail? It's a sheet. It's an armor that they put over, and it's a lot like fish scales. You know how fish scales are? You run down on one way and it's smooth, but what happens when you go back up against it? And that's like his armor. That coat of mail was over his front and back, and those scales ran downward. If you ran back up, it'd lift them up, but it ran downward. And how much did that thing weigh? 5,000 shekels. Does anybody know how many pounds that was? That's exactly, every one of you are right on the money. We're going to say 150 pounds. Anywhere between 150 to 200 pounds was the weight of the coat of mail. Now, he wore that. He had that on his, he draped it over his shoulders and had it over his torso. 150 pounds. Have you ever gone to the store or the Lowe's or Home Depot and bought a 50-pound bag of topsoil, or a 50-pound bag of sand, or a 50-pound bag of peat moss, 50-pound bag of something? And did you put it over your shoulder? He had 3 of those. 3 of those that he wore, and it was nothing to him. It didn't take away nothing from his ability to fight. Now that's what size of guy we're talking about here. Versus who? A 16-year-old. He had greaves of brass upon his legs. Those are like shin guards. You see soccer players out there on the soccer field going up and down, and they're in their shorts, but you see their socks are pulled over, and their legs down there between their knee and their foot, they're about that big around. Well, they've got shin guards on. And that's what the idea is here when it talks about greaves of brass upon his legs. He had a target of brass between his shoulders. That's like a javelin or his sword. Okay? Verse 7, he had the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. That's a lot like a weaver's beam is a lot like a 2x4. Think of a big 2x4. And then you had the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. How heavy was that? 20 pounds. 20 pounds. He had a long, what we would call a long 2x4 with a 20-pound iron head on it. And it was a spear. Getting ready to fight a 16-year-old. And then if that's not enough, it doesn't say anything about this guy. He had one bearing a shield that went before him. That's all he says about him. Like he really needs him. Okay? I guess that's his introductory when he walks into the battle. This guy follows him in there, or leads him in there rather. Carry the shield. I know it. Yeah. I know it. I know it. But you've got a guy that's got 150 pounds of armor across his torso. He's got a beam. He's got a spear that the head of it weighs 20 pounds. He's got all of this brass and iron covering his whole body pretty much. He's 9.5 feet tall. And it says down in verse 8, he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and you're the servants to Saul? Choose a man and let him come down to me. Pick you one out and let's fight. Verse 9, if he's able to fight with me and kill me, we will be your servants. We will serve you. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you'll be our servants and serve us. So, at this time, my third question, do you think Goliath was aware of who the Israelites were? You don't think so?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Well, the story that Jericho knew who God was, and they were afraid because they knew what had happened there. I'm sure that the Philistines understood who God was and the things that had happened. So he could have known about it, whether he was a person that had known about that kind of stuff. I don't know. He may not have been too well educated, but there was a good chance he did. Probably a good chance he did.
Yeah. I think he did. I think he knew from the history of the Philistines and the Israelites. I mean, it goes way, way back, years and years back. And this Goliath, I don't know how big he was at birth. But from a baby growing up, he's heard about the battles of these people of God out there fighting against our gods. And I think he's heard about that from day one. And I think he knew exactly who these people were. And these Israelites were. And the terrible history between the two was not good. Verse, where am I? Verse 11, verse 10 rather. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now look at the reaction of Saul and all of Israel. When they heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. In my Bible, right across the column, right across in verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and they were sore afraid. You've got greatly afraid, you have sore afraid. What's some other versions have? Deadly afraid. How much? What? Dreadly? Dreadful? What else? Any more? So, that term sore, they were sore afraid. If you remember back in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was in the garden, there's a term that describes him. He was sore amazed. Sore amazed. That's depression. He was in the deepest degree of depression that you could be in. And when it says sore amazed, that's the deepest that you can get. And over here, it's pretty much the same principle with this word. They were sore afraid or greatly afraid. There's really no other degree of fear than what Saul and Israel, what they were experiencing at this time. And so, what in the world are we going to do? Yes, sir.
Just one of the other things that always gets my attention is in verse 8 where he says, he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, think about his physical presence, the armor that he's got on, and just think of the volume of his voice, what it must be and how it would just naturally reverberate in the cavity of his chest as big as it must have been. And him crying out. So you can see why they would be afraid.
Well, sure.
His physical presence, along with his voice, was more intimidating than anything that they had, been challenged by with regard to one man.
Exactly. Exactly. I read across that. I read across that when he stood and cried into the armies of Israel. I didn't catch that until you just brought it up. But that's exactly right. A 9.5-foot giant just really. That they did not realize that at this time. Ricky.
Go back to number 14, verse 1. It's almost the exact copy of the way they say it, with the reaction of the Israelites when they came back and had the bad report. You just talked about one of the numbers in chapter 13.
Read it. Numbers 14:1. Read it, Ricky.
So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. They were scared to death.
Scared to death.
They were upset. They had come out there. They cried because they couldn't win. There was giants out there, and now we're right back to the same people, essentially, people of God, sent out to battle again, and we got the same situation, and again we got a copy of what happened.
Exactly. We're like grasshoppers. And what are these Anakims going to do to grasshoppers? They're going to stomp them. They're going to stomp them. Any other comments before we go into the next section? Yes, sir.
Back there in verse 10, he says he defied the armies of Israel. He also was defying God.
Definitely.
I defy your armies. Because they all had their gods, and they all had a God that would fight for them. They believed good at one thing or another. So when you went against an army, you went against that God.
Exactly.
He knew that, but he also should have known who God was, because back in 1 Samuel 4, whenever
Yeah, this is.
There, their God is
Hmm.
basically
They were scared at that time. They were. Good point.
That they had forgotten God, and so had God's people.
God's people.
Unfortunately.
They were both guilty at this point in time. Okay, we will take up with verse. Great comments. Thank you so much for the study tonight. We'll take up with verse 12 of 1 Samuel 17 next week, and we will continue our story with this teenager.